I have my 96 Corvette with me. This was a very significant year in Corvette development because it was the last year they made the C4. And this car contained the gift that GM engineers gave to Corvette buyers that opted for the LT4. Some of you are probably wondering, what is an LT4? Well, it's quite simple. The LT1 is the base model engine that was there from 92 through 96, and the LT4 was more or less a hotter version of it. Had larger cylinder heads, it had a half-inch lift cam, a nodular crank, a dual mass damper, a lot of things, sodium-filled valve stems to improve the horsepower. Now, it also revved a lot higher, and that's essentially how they did it. The torque is exactly the same, 340 foot-pounds. But what they decided to do in 96 was just give Corvette buyers that year something special that they could purchase, because prior to that, they had the ZR1 all the way until 95. But once 95 ended, they were done with the ZR1, and the LT4 became the hot ticket item for that year. And that's the car that I have. Okay, so the base model LT1 made 300 horsepower, 340 foot-pounds of torque. Believe the max power was at 5,000 RPMs, and the LT4 made its max horsepower at 6,300 RPMs. Because if I'm never testing it out on the street, I don't want all the attention of the police. That clamshell hood just looks phenomenal. That really looks cool. When you see that first image that comes to my mind is that is a serious sports car right there. Now, brief history of my car. I purchased it in February of 98. The whole idea behind it was going to be my daily driver. I had it until the spring of 2003 when I decided, I wanted to start racing. I had enough money in my pocket at that time, and I was really motivated to start racing. So even at that time, even though I knew very little about racing, I did know that I wanted to... that I definitely needed to have like a daily driver car and a race car, not just a daily driver that's a race car. Because if you break your race car, then you have no way to get to work, right? I figured that out pretty quickly. Anyway, spring of 2003 is when I decided to do that. I bought like a used Saturn with 100,000 miles on it, like an SL2, I think is what it was called. And once I did that, I was able to start focusing on getting my 96 ready to race. Now, it was completely stock at that time. There was a couple things I knew I needed to do. I talked to some pretty knowledgeable people and did a Z51 sway bar. It would have been nice if I had a Z51 suspension with this, but it was an FE2 car, and that's basically the cruiser suspension. And it's not the best for handling, but it has excellent ride. The other thing, what really happened was when I met my mechanic, David Bonar, around that time, he basically told me some of the things that I really needed to do to get the car ready to race. Because the first time I raced the car, all I had on it was a Z51 sway bar. I did a few things, like I put an X-frame underneath it, and I'll show you that in greater detail as we get into the minutia of the car. I also put a camber brace in, stuff to improve the structural rigidity of the car. Because the problem with C4s is they don't have as good engineering in their frame that, say, a C5 has, which are pretty phenomenal. Okay, there's a couple things you probably see right off the bat. I got CCW wheels on here. Now here's the thing, I pretty much only use these things to race. And essentially, I really only use this car to race, so I haven't really had any reason to take the CCWs off. I do have 17 by 11 inch chrome A molds, which are ZR1 wheels, C4 ZR1 wheels. But these wheels are a lot better because they're something like, yeah, these wheels are about 8 to 10 pounds lighter. I think they're 8 pounds lighter in the front, and I believe 10 pounds lighter in the back. I weighed them at some point, but I don't remember the exact details of that. If you know it, you can leave it in the comment section. Okay, starting with some of the basics. First thing I did, of course, was do a Z51 sway bar, which is a larger sway bar. One of the things you'll find out if you ever buy a C4 is the stock Bilsteins are pretty lousy shocks. They leak gas in a couple of years, like 4 years. Mine were completely done in 4 to 5 years. Even my dad's, as slow as he drives, were the gas that leaked out of them in 6 to 8 years. So they're not very good. You can have them revalved. What I did instead is I went with the Coney shocks, and that was Dave Bonar's, he recommended it, and I gotta say, the shocks made an instant difference. Like every single thing you do to improve, the handling characteristics of the car, the chassis, it really shows up when you have a great set of shocks on. And also, I've been racing the car since 2003 when I put them on, and they haven't leaked one drop of gas, and they've been perfect. And they're also adjustable as well. Okay, let's start with the engine, of course. You're all really interested in this. Okay, one of the things that's so great about C4s is the clamshell hood. I mean, literally everything goes up with it, including the quarter panels. Now, insurance companies absolutely hated that because anytime you had an accident right here in the front quarter panel, they'd have to replace the whole entire hood. So I love it because, as you can see, you get complete look at everything. You can see your complete tire exposed. You can see the upper and lower A-arm suspension. You can get access to the engine quite easily. It's really quite interesting the way GM did that in the design. And yes, I always use Optima batteries. Don't settle for anything less. They're not paying me to say that. I just really believe in it. Okay, starting with this engine here. So originally this was a stock LT4. And what ended up happening was around 2007, I'd been racing about 5 years, 5 full seasons. And it was sometime around the spring of, no, it was later than that. It was around the summer of 2007. I was racing at Marina, which is the old Fort Ord Air Base in next to Monterey, but not in Monterey. And I could hear kind of an inaudible, a very just quiet sound in the bottom end of the engine. I thought it was the bottom end of the engine. So at the time, where I live here in Tracy, there used to be a track not too far from where I live. And it was basically a circle track, and inside of it, it had like a road course. And my autocross club, Santa Clara Corvettes, would actually use that for some of their home autocross events. Now, most of the events that we hosted were always in Marina, but in this particular case, this one was in Tracy. And it was a lot of fun because, you get to use the circle track. You could use the straightaways. They're banked. You can get a lot of speed. Then you go into the middle, and it was a whole entire autocross course. It was really a lot of fun. But the last time I raced there, I could kind of hear a very subtle sound. Now, to me, it sounded like it was coming from the bottom part of the engine. Now, here's the thing. You got to understand. Most of the guys that I raced with at that time were a lot older than me. They still are. And they don't have as good of ears as I have. And I would say most people don't have the kind of ears I have being a music producer. So I can kind of hear and locate sound really well. And I remember telling Dave, I hear something. I'm not sure what's going on with that. So he listened to it. Of course, he couldn't really hear anything definitive. He thought it was like the pulleys, possibly. Well, long story short, the next week when I was racing at Marina, on my third run, I noticed it started to lose power. Now, that's always a sure tell sign that something's going on with your bearings when it all of a sudden starts to lose power. Maybe if your oil temperatures get really hot for no apparent reason, maybe you're on your third lap like I was, they shouldn't be getting that hot. Anyway, I drove it balls to the walls because I wanted my fourth lap to be a better time than my third, which was a bit disappointing. And when I got halfway through the course, my engine completely grenaded. I mean, literally, the rod went right through the block. The pan exploded. I remember Dave walking up to me about maybe 5 minutes after my engine blowing up, and you could literally see the connecting rod that he picked up, the I-beam, was 50 feet from where it blew out of my block, which is kind of crazy, and it shows how dangerous racing can be. I believe that's one of the reasons why, if you're a drag racer, they want you to have a scatter shield, because that protects the driver if you're behind the firewall. Anyway, so it was completely destroyed. It was quite an episode getting it off the track because it's leaking oil everywhere, a lot of kitty litter. And the funny thing is, I made the cover of Cone magazine. And I didn't make the cover of Cone magazine because I've won my class 3 or 4 years. No, I made it because I grenaded my engine in spectacular fashion. There's a picture of me literally pushing the car. Yeah, it was bad. In fact, when all the oil came out of the block and poured on the headers, flame shot out of it. So some of the guys were calling me Scott Flamin' Loman. I don't know, that doesn't sound really good. Anyway, so I was in a dilemma because I was trying to figure out, what do I want to do? Do I want to just build, another 350 with better heads and everything? Or do I want to go to a stroker? Now, my buddy Dave actually gave me good advice on it. He basically said, the higher you rev the engine, the shorter the lifespan is going to be on it. And I took that to heart. So he ended up building a 355. He went in a different direction than me. And my buddy Dave has the same exact car as I have. It's a 96. It's black on black, just like this car. And in addition, it's also came with the FE2 suspension. Now, of course, since that time, we've modified all of that. But he actually went a different direction. He went with a 355, high compression, 13-to-1. And really spins the RPMs. I think that thing revs over 7,500 RPMs. And partly why he's able to do that, he has very light valve train. And of course, that's a lot more expensive. And having that high compression, it's not the greatest thing for the longevity of the engine. So I decided to go a different way. I went with larger displacement, light rotating assembly. And instead of going to really high compression, I just went to 11 2-to-1. So he runs 110 octane. I run 110 octane for 4 gallons. And then the rest of it is Supreme in California. So initially, I was trying to build a 392, which is exactly like the Dodge engines. Now, my buddy Dave doesn't like 383s, and I know a lot of you are going to ask me in the comments section. I can only tell you what he tells me is that they don't rev very high because the dwell time's low. That's all I know. And basically, 383 is just a larger crank, same size pistons and rods. It's not really any different other than the larger crank. With the 392, you have larger pistons. They've been bored 30 over with the larger crank, so you make 392 cubic inches. Now, whenever you order an engine, or a rotating assembly, it's the most expensive thing that you're going to purchase. The cylinder heads I know are really expensive as well, but truthfully, you want to have a great rotating assembly. You want to have a forged crank, rods, forged aluminum pistons, because you want your engine to hold up under a lot of duress and heat, because that's what happens when you race. So what I ended up doing was I had to order basically a rotating assembly for a 397. And why is that? I could not get 30 over pistons with that crank that I wanted. So I ended up with 40 over pistons, and it was a 397. Now, the crank I got on it's pretty amazing. It's a Cali's crank. It's basically their top of the line crank. It's super light. It's 4340 forged, and it's made out of something called Timken steel, which is the lightest, hardest steel you can make a crank with. The year I bought it, which was 2013. Okay, so what did I do with the cylinder heads? Well, I went with Airflow Research heads. Airflow Research heads definitely makes the best cylinder heads. They're pretty amazing, the power that they make. And all in all, I mean, this car made about more than 120 horsepower, more like 150 after everything was said and done. Now, I do have headers on here, as you can see, but they're not the greatest headers. And unfortunately, when you own a C4, there just isn't a lot of header options on them. I would love to have something like Cook's headers, but instead I ended up with Stainless Steel Works, and it's because at that time they were the only company that made some headers that would actually fit an LT1, LT4 engine. And there's a lot of clearance issues, as you can see. Problem with headers, you know, you end up frying your spark plug wires, your spark plugs. You just have to really be careful about how you insulate everything. As you can see, Dave does immaculate work here. You notice all the insulation on it. It's really held up quite well. All right, so if I was to do anything additional, I would get custom welded headers with 1 3/4 inch primaries. What I have on there is 1 5/8 inches, which isn't much bigger than what you would get with the shorty headers that some of the other companies make. But they're long tube, they scavenge better, and I do have a 3-inch collector, so they make power. They're a lot better than the regular manifolds, plus they're a lot lighter. Now, some of the other things we had to do that I went with, you notice the intake manifold. Now, it's a little bit tricky if you've ever seen these LT4s before, because one of the distinguishing marks on it is the red intake manifold, which is right here. I went with the Edelbrock because it's called the air gap. It creates sort of cooling, keeps the oil and the air separate on the intake. And I have a BBK throttle body. I'm trying to think of I think it's a 58 millimeter throttle body, I believe. Dual throttle body. I used to have a 52 on it. The stock one's 48. But once I went with the stroker motor, I decided to go with the larger 58-inch throttle body. Make more power that way, get more air in, more air out, got more power. Okay, so I do have a catch can here and some simple things like that. This air intake is really pretty amazing. This is called a vortex, and it really creates a lot of air intake here. And one thing you have to understand about air intakes, cold air intakes, you want them low, not high. So everything comes from the bottom here. That's really important because the air definitely needs to get in under there and get in not only the air intake, but also your radiator, your oil cooler, and things like that. Now, there's a couple other things you're going to have to do if you are a racer and you have a C4 and you go with these race tires here, which I haven't told you what they are. They're actually Hoosier A6s. Now, they're older tires. As you know, if you've watched some of my other videos, my car was gone for 7 years because we had this weird ABS issue that we couldn't get to the bottom of. Well, everything's fine now. We have another ABS controller in it. But I kept these tires in the garage in a cool place for 7 years, and they actually work pretty good. Now, are they as good as the A7 Hoosiers that are out now? No, they're not. But, you know, I'm racing on a shoestring budget here. So I really don't have the money to where I can just go ahead and fork over $1,600 for new tires when these tires are still perfectly good. So I'm going to run these things until they cord, and they're pretty grippy, and as you can see, there's still a lot of wear on it. Those are the wear markers right there, and there's still some room there, so I'm definitely happy with them. Going over the size of these CCW wheels, they're 17 by 12 inch in the back, and they're 17 by 11 inch up front. So I have 315s in every corner. You know, the back tires look a little bit wider, and it's partly because, well, it's due entirely to the fact that I have 12-inch wheels in the back. And you may say, well, Scott, how is that? You know, if you have a 315 wheel, a 315 tire, why would it be wider in the back than the front? Because the wheels are wider, and it just kind of spreads them out wider. And the wider the wheel you have, to a degree, it's better. So I could put 335s in the back, but the problem is then it'll start to rub here. And I've already got some spacers on the back, just some slight spacers that move it out a little teeny bit. And the reason why we do that is it rubs a little bit. Now with the 17 by 11 inch ZR1 wheels, it doesn't rub it at all because of the spacing of the wheels. So these wheels were originally on a C5 Z06, and it was a friend of mine. His name is Joe Fernandez, and fortunately for him, he survived a car accident at Sonoma Raceway in a Z06, very similar to mine. And he had a Hans device on, and as a result, he survived the accident, thank God, but the car was totally trashed. Now, interestingly enough, the wheels were salvageable, and they weren't bent at all. I just got lucky, and he wanted to get rid of them. He didn't want the Z06 anymore, so I bought the wheels for a very good price, and I'm very fortunate he sold them to me at the price that he did. They also came with tires, so that was a good plus. Okay, some of the other things you'll see here, the catch can, that's really good too. what happens when you run low tension rings, sometimes the engine will have some blow by. But although this engine really hasn't put out a lot of blow by recently, it did when it was new, but it seems to be getting better as everything kind of wears in with age. And I still don't have very many miles on this engine. Like I said, it's been mostly, almost completely a race engine. You know, I drove it, I don't know, about 3,000 miles on the street just to try to break it in properly, because I knew there was no way I was going to be able to break this engine in properly at a track, even though Dave's like, oh, come on, just go half throttle and short shift it. But, you know, I know myself well enough to know I'm not going to do that when I get out there. I'm going to get competitive. I'm going to start driving fast. So glad I did what I did, even though I took kind of a chance, you know, driving on the street with a race car. Okay, next thing, when you're racing and you go to race tires like this, you really need something called an AccuSump. And the AccuSump is crucial because when you start putting race tires on these cars, you know, you're making well over a G in the corners. And what happens is oil starts to slosh. And when you get into that situation, what happens is the oil fails to properly lube the bottom end of the engine, and then you end up with some real serious issues like your bearings not getting enough oil, and then you lose an engine. So I was always very careful to listen to what Dave recommended I do when I kept stepping things up with racing when I went to the race tires. And like I said, you're probably wondering, well, what happened to your old engine? That's a good question. I did have an AccuSump on that as well. But see, what you have to understand is this. When I bought my car in February of 1998, there was a guy that had it before me, and he drove it for almost 20,000 miles. I think it was like 17,500. And he was very hard on the car. The car had more wear than it should have. It had the wrong coolant in it. He clearly didn't take care of it. And when I got it, I purchased an extended warranty, and it's a good thing I did because it spun a rod bearing at 48,000. Now you're probably wondering, why did it do that? I don't know. Sometimes things happen. Your oil pump can intermittently fail. And that's the problem with internal combustion engines. There's a lot going on. You have fuel, air spark, you have lubrication. Anytime something fails in one of those areas, you could have a catastrophic failure, especially when it comes to oiling or heat, cooling. And that's also what oil does as well. It also cools, synthetic oil cools the bottom end. So it spun a rod bearing, and, you know, I went to the dealership. This is when Anderson Chevrolet was in Menlo Park. It was like one of the biggest Corvette dealers in Northern California at the time. And I had the extended warranty, so they basically rebuilt the engine, but they did it very cheaply. They did put a nice forged crank in it. It was a GM forged crank, a 350. But what they did was they didn't resize the rods. So 50,000 miles later, when I was racing, the rods started to wear elliptically instead of in a circular way. And what happens is when one part of the rod gets more heat than the other, the bearings will completely wear out. And that's what happened. And that's what that kind of inaudible noise was that I was hearing that no one else was hearing. Now, look, it'd be great to go back in time, get the car on the lift, pull the pan, and have, you know, save the block. But it is what it is. We had to find another engine block. Thank God we did. And things worked out. It was, you know, pretty expensive what I did building the stroker motor, but I'm very happy that I did it because I kid you not, this engine feels every bit as powerful as like an LS7. It's stock with maybe bolt-ons. Yeah, I know. It's kind of funny to think about, like a stock LS7. It makes this kind of power right from the jump with maybe a few little bolt-ons. Yeah, the capability of the LS motors are pretty stunning and amazing. But the LT1s and LT4s are really nice too. The only real knock on these engines, and if you've watched some of my other videos, is that MSD, excuse me, not the MSD, the OptiSpark from GM. The fix for it is the MSD OptiSpark, which is a self-contained unit. It's sealed. It keeps oil and moisture off of it. I want to talk briefly about the springs on it. As you can see, they're basically monoleaf, and what that basically means is if you look down here, I'm going to try to point to it, not the easiest thing. Right there at the very bottom, the black thing, that's one of the springs. And it goes from there all the way over to the other side of the engine, of course, to the other upper and lower A-arm suspension over on the other side here. And as you can see, that's where the spring connects to. And it's called monoleaf springs. Now, I changed my springs because when I did this engine, I found it really sort of upset the handling. Now, you're probably wondering, why would it upset the handling? Well, it does because a few simple reasons. You're accelerating a lot faster. When you're accelerating a lot faster, there's a lot more pitch, there's a lot more dive. And even when you brake, you know, that's the main thing that I noticed at first when I put the engine in. I remember Dave telling me, he's like, you're going to want to modify the brakes more. And I'm thinking, why? You already modified the brakes. The brakes work great. And he just kind of looked at me like, yeah, famous last words. And I didn't know what he meant by that. And then when I started driving the car, right, I quickly realized, oh, damn, he's right. The handling's not as good with the FE2 springs and a stroker motor like this. So what you definitely need to do is you need to stiffen up the springs, and that was the magic bullet. So basically I have an 800-pound spring in the front and a 475-pound spring in the back. Now, Dave doesn't really like me disclosing information like that because he considers it proprietary information. I don't even care. I mean, like, I want people to do well with their C4s and kick ass, so I'll disclose some of the secrets, not all the secrets. Now, one of the other things that's really nice about Corvettes in terms of the way the engineering is, notice how the engine is mounted very low and far back. Now, you see this even more on my Z06, but you definitely saw it in the C4s. This is the main reason why General Motors stuck to the pushrod V8, because during this time you had the Ford going with the 4.6 liter modular, which is an overhead cam design. And even though overhead cams, you know, they're better as far as the power they can make for the amount of displacement they have, I always felt like there was one major flaw with those modular engines that I didn't like about them, is that they're much larger. Even though the displacement's smaller, go look at the cylinder heads on a 4.6 liter from this time period. They are much, much larger. And the engine, when you look at the 4.6 liter next to mine, you would swear that's the bigger engine. And yet this one's almost 400 cubic inches. And the 4.6 liters less than 302 cubic inches. The new 5 liter one's 302 cubic inches. I don't know off the top of my head exactly. I think it's 281 or something like that with a 4.6 liter. And I get the argument is you have more advanced cylinder heads, you know, with overhead cam timing and everything. It can make up the difference. But I always felt like that engine looked big. It was always mounted. To me, it always looked like it was up too high. And a lot of guys that wanted to put superchargers on them would oftentimes have to change their hood because it wasn't mounted low and it wasn't mounted back far enough. And this is why the Corvettes were so much quicker on tracks than the Mustangs were in that time period. So little piece of history there, you know, and why I really was into Corvettes. So one of the things, the advantages you get when you have a smooth surface there as opposed to like a hilly coupling surface, it's just the air flows through it a lot better and you get more power. That's what's really nice about that. And as you can see, there is like serious sealing going on here with air. And the idea is you don't want to mix the cool air with the hot air, because the cool air is going in this clear plastic thing right here. That's what seals the air filter inside. And when you close the hood, none of the hot engine heat goes into the air intake. What will happen in that case, you'll have the computer will sense too much heat in the air intake and it will pull off timing and you'll lose horsepower. Even though there's no reason for it to do that, it will sense too high a temperatures. And that's why anytime you have a cold air intake, you don't want it exposed without being sealed, because then you'll get too much heat through the air intake. And you, like I said, you want to limit the amount of heat that goes inside the engine. You want cool air going in the engine, hot air going out of the engine. All right, we're gonna go underneath the front, and maybe I can show you some of the things that has gone on, like with the oil cooler and everything else that we put in the front. Okay, looking at the underneath part, there's just not a lot to see here because everything's sealed up. But this is basically the air goes in through here. We have a net here because, as you can see, look at all the things that have smashed into it. This happens all the time when you race, I'm telling you. It can be the clearest, cleanest track, and there will be things that will bang into it at high speeds. And it's important because I have a really expensive oil cooler that runs across here. And I'm telling you, my oil cooler, it is literally the size of an intercooler. And it's got dual fans on it. So it's hard to see all of that. There's just really no way, there's just really no way to get under there and get a good clean look at that, all right? If there's ever a time where I can show you that, I will show you that, okay? Here are the Coney shocks. It's pretty simple. There's a little, you could use a wrench, but it's got a little teeny cap you put on top. This is the cap, and what you do is you put this cap, it goes right on top of it there. It's actually, I don't know. It's hard to hold the camera and do this, but anyway, this cap goes right on top and you twist it to adjust it. And if you want a firm setting, you turn it this way. If you want a looser setting, you turn it that way. And like I said, Coney is the way to go. And one of the great things about Corvettes, look at this beautiful upper and lower A-arm suspension. I mean, this is one of the reasons why these cars handle so phenomenally well. This is high tech from the 90s. Okay, one more thing I want to show you, power steering fluid here. And I just want to talk to you for a moment about that. If you ever owned a C4 Corvette and you're driving it and you notice that sometimes when you're making a three-point turn or you're in a parking lot, it feels like the power steering sort of cuts out and then comes back on again. That's because it does that. These things have terrible power steering pumps. They don't do well with heat. They don't dissipate heat very well. So you should always use the best quality fluid in there. And if you're ever frustrated because you're at the track or something and you feel like the fluid you put in there is starting to boil over, Dave's even puts, my mechanic Dave even puts Mobile One in it, just to thicken it up so it could handle the heat better. Now, I never did that, and I don't really give a shit that my power steering pump works and doesn't work, because when I'm out there, I can turn that wheel just fine. I've had people drive my car and they look at me sideways like, how do you drive this thing? I can barely turn the wheel sometimes. For me, that's not a problem, especially when you're in forward motion. I find it just kind of, I'd say, moderately heavy, which is what I prefer in steering. And you know, having these larger wheels, I mean, this big tire patch here, this 315, definitely complicates it, but I'm actually okay with it. And then right in there is your coolant tank here. And yeah, you just read that right there where it says cool and hot. There's plenty in there. You just screw that back on. I know it's kind of janky looking. It looks like kind of like a milk carton or something. But I have a nice aluminum one in my C5 Z06, and when I do a review on that, I'll show you how nice that one looks. But, you know, that's really probably the only really janky thing on this car that I look at that just really looks terrible. But, you know, I don't know that they even make an aftermarket tank for that, but I'm sure Dave has something. Maybe I'll have him do that one day. It's just, you know, there's always things that you need to do to your car when you're a racer, and it's just like you don't want to waste your money on things that like don't add to speed on the track or reliability in terms of how it runs. Okay, so one of the things that really annoys me about automotive journalists is they've always said C4s and C5s have terrible interiors. You know, I fundamentally disagree with that. So given the price point that they were at the time, they're actually okay. I get it, the materials aren't as nice as what you saw with Porsches or BMWs or Mercedes, but you were paying upwards of 30 grand for those cars. I mean, above the price of what this one was. So if you just consider how much more you were paying for a BMW, a Mercedes, especially a Porsche, you really can't compare. But where I like to compare is with the ergonomics, okay? So this is where I think Corvettes are really superior. Okay, first thing I'm going to show you is the sport seat. The reason why I got to tell you this, there is one way where you could criticize Corvettes from this era. They had terrible seats. Now, some of the earlier model ones I felt like had a little bit better lateral support, depending on, you know, how big of a person you are, how large your torso is. In 96 and 95, they had some, specifically 96, they had some pretty nice sport seats for the C4. These did not come with that. They were pretty nice in general. I mean, they were comfortable, but they really didn't hold you in place. And when you get to racing, it creates a lot of problems if you can't be held in place. One of the things that it leads to is you tend to hang on to the steering wheel when you're going really fast through corners. That was something I did all the time. And as a result, I broke 2 steering columns. I know it sounds crazy, but here's the thing. They have really shitty, cheap pot metal they put inside of it, so it doesn't take much to damage it. And some of the older guys that are long in the tooth, that aren't very strong, that bought these Corvettes, they would oftentimes, because they had difficulty getting out of the car, they would pull on the steering column. And when you do that, it's just a matter of time before the whole steering column starts to collapse. That happened to me twice, but it wasn't from pulling on it, getting in and out of it. It was me literally hanging onto it when I'm going around turns. Okay, so here's the sport seat, and this is why I talked to you about the crappy pot metal inside the steering column here. What I ended up doing was getting a carbo seat, because in a lot of ways it's like an imitation or a fake Recaro. It has a lot of the ergonomics. It's just, as you can see, the materials, you know, are not as nice as what you would get with a Recaro seat. But that's okay. Recaros are big money. This was not big money. Now, in order to make this work, you really need to have a 5-point harness. And what I have right here is really the best 5-point harness you can get. It's called Impact. It was a company that was started by Bill Simpson, the guy that started his own company, Simpson 5- and 6-point harnesses. And for whatever reason, he ended up getting pushed out of his own company, and he started Impact. And the thing is, once Bill Simpson left his company, Simpson, the quality went downhill. I mean, these are really nice. Just the fit and finish on this is nice, and it has great adjustments here, and it'll really hold you in place. Now, what you have to do is mount them to the frame of the car. And down here, it's hard to get in here to really see this, but this is where you mount them to the floor. That goes in between the legs. And then you use the existing seat belt mount for the lap belt, which is right here. I'm trying to dig this out. There we go. Just like that. And then, of course, it connects right here, just like that. And I'll get you a better view of that so you can see how that works. Okay, so here's a better shot of the 5-point harness, looking down on it. So this is it right here. This goes in first, then the lap belts, and then the 2 shoulder harnesses. So that's kind of hard for me to do that and hold the camera at the same time, but you get the idea here. And it's a cam lock, and you always want a cam lock so you can get out of it quickly. And how quickly can you get out of this? Check it out. Boom. See that? You're out of your belts almost instantly. So if you ever have a fire or some reason to get out of your vehicle quickly, you can do it. All right. Okay, now like I mentioned earlier, the interior is a lot nicer in here than they give you credit for, because the ergonomics is excellent. Okay, so looking around in here, where you're seated, this is probably one of the best things I love about Corvette interiors. Even in a C5, it's very similar. The one area I'd say the C5 is a lot better in, it's got a lot more headroom. I mean, here's the thing. If you have a helmet on and you have a factory seat and you're anywhere near 6 feet tall or above, I guarantee you're going to be racing with your head forward, and that is not good for your neck. So what I ended up having to do is I had to literally mount the seat to the floor. There's no track on it for it to slide on. It's not adjustable front and back. It is literally bolted right to the chassis. It's basically bolted to the frame. And the reason why I did that was I have a lot of headroom now. If you take a look at where my head is, I've got a lot of room. I could fit my hand in between here. Now, normally on a factory C4, or how this car was with a factory seat, my head would be up so high it would almost be touching the roof. And I wouldn't consider myself to be a really tall person. I'm just a smidge under 6 feet tall, right? And you'd think I was 6'4" in this car. Okay, now, I enjoy the ergonomics in here because you're very low in the car, and that's important because you feel everything that is going on. And that's just something that I think other cars, you ride too high, you don't have as direct connection to the road as you do in one of these. Now, a lot of people complain about these materials. This actually feels really good to me. I don't know. It actually feels a little better than my C5, this part on the dash. And it's the same thing on the door panels as well. Feels pretty nice. I mean, I don't really see it as anything bad. Got the gauges here. I'm going to go over that in just a moment. And of course, it's got the passenger side airbag over there. And one of the cool features, I'll try to show this at night on my iPhone, is right under here you have night lights that come on. So when the engine's running, those lights, they kind of illuminate right around here, and it allows you to find the latch to the doors and, you know, the locks and everything else. And other interesting thing is there is actual storage in these areas. Here's one of my, oh man, here's one of my old Scarface albums. Haven't seen that in a long time. Anyway, yeah, so you can fit stuff inside of there, close it, everything works good, you know, pushing 30 years old with this car. And same thing on the driver's side, same thing. Everything is situated very well. Okay, here's the 6-speed manual. I have what is known as the B&M short throw shifter, and I really love this thing because I feel like it just has really great throws. It's very direct. So this is first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then of course reverse. All very short, easy throws. And what I love about it too is, like, if you're ever at a track and you're blazing down the straightaway in 4th gear or 3rd gear, to go down to 2nd, you know, you just pop it neutral and do one of these and you're in 2nd. Or maybe you're in 3rd gear, that's 1st, this is 3rd, and you want to get down to 2nd from a high speed. Look, you just pop it into neutral and you know instantly where it is at that point, bottom left. And all of this can be done, you know, lightning quick, right? So I love it. All right, now there's a bunch of switches in this car, and you're going to see this a lot with race cars. Oh, but before I get into that, there is a center console here, and I like the way it's organized. These were designed for tapes back in the day, but I don't think anybody's listened to cassette tapes in a very long time. So I just keep my fuel door key here, and all my important things in here as well, including the latch to take the top off. And I don't really want to talk too much about that because that's kind of the basics of a C4. And I think, you know, I'll get into that more when I talk about the structural rigidity of the car in a future video, in which, you know, you can really improve the structural integrity of the car. Because like I said before, one of the problems with the C4 was literally when you remove the roof, you would lose some of the structure of the car, and that's not really a problem on the C5s and newer because they have a lot better frame technology. But you could make up for a lot of this with just a few things that really improve the chassis, and of course I'll talk a little more at length about that in a moment. Let's go over some of the buttons and then the gauges. Okay, so here we are. This actually controls my fans on my oil cooler. Now, I would love to show you pictures of that, but I really can't do it because it's literally buried underneath the radiator shroud and all sealed up. But basically, I have this really nice oil cooler that's the size of an intercooler, and it's got 2 fans on it. And I do have a switch for those fans, so I can turn those fans on when the engine's off, and while the hood's open, it can help cool, you know, the oil. And that's the thing that gets really hot when you race. And the other interesting thing too is every time you turn the engine on, if you leave the switch on, it will, or turn the ignition on and every time you turn the engine on, it will actually run the fans automatically on the oil cooler. So I always run the oil cooler fans all the time, even if it's not a hot day. Maybe I won't do it on the first lap or the warm-up lap, but on the second one on, definitely it's on. Because the more power you make, the more heat transfer you're going to be dealing with. And I'll show you a little more with the cooling when I get back under the hood again, but I want to show you a little more of the interior. All right, so now we're going over these these switches. Now, both of these actually control the fans to the engine. So I could even run my cooling fans when the engine's off. I just have to have the ignition on. Same thing with the oil cooler right here, okay? And I also have a switch for the AccuSump, which is right here. Now this is very nice because this allows me to fill up oil in the AccuSump, and the advantage of that is when you go to start it up, how much oil you have inside the AccuSump will increase the oil pressure when you start it, before you start it, just by turning the ignition on. Okay, let's go over some of the gauges here. Now, one of the things I absolutely love about C4s is the, sorry for the noise there, I don't have the seatbelt in, is the gauges. I mean, the gauges are just pretty stunning here. I mean, as you can see, just immediately with the analog gauges, you have oil pressure, oil temperature, coolant, and volts right there available, along with miles per hour. And just below that, where it says cool, that means Fahrenheit. It's right below the fuel gauge there. Those are all the gauges you can get in analog, in addition to what you see here. Now, also to the left is a tachometer, and if you want one little trick to find out how to quickly find out the difference between an LT4 car and an LT1 car, if you notice here, I have an 8,000 RPM tach. See that? Normally, it's like a 6,500 RPM tach for the LT1, and they knew people were going to be modifying these and revving them higher, so I think that's probably why they did that. Okay, now you see this little section right here. This controls your gauges. First, let's go look and see all the gauges. Now, every time you tap on this, it's going to give you a different gauge on the display. See the gauge here? Now I go ahead and tap on it. We're at coolant. Now the next one is volts, and the next one after that is oil temperature, and the next one after that we're back to coolant temperature. If you go just above it and you go to fuel information and you tap that, it'll give you your mileage. And if you hit that trip odometer, it'll tell you how many miles you've been on your trip, and you hit that again, you get your mileage again. I got 112,000 factory miles on this. So then you hit fuel information again, it'll give you your fuel economy, and as you can see, this is a very economical car. I'm averaging 5 miles to the gallon, which is what happens when you race. And I'm sorry, go back to fuel gauges again. Hit it again, it tells you how much range you have left on the tank. And if you hit it again, it'll give you instant fuel economy, or instant miles per gallon. Now, a lot of this seems like straightforward stuff now in 2022. Just keep in mind, most of these gauges, if not all of these gauges, were available back in when the C4 came out in '84. Now, that's what had the Night Rider dash. Somebody asked me the other day in the comment section when this particular gauge cluster came out, what year it was, and it was actually 1991. So the last year of the L98 is when they had this gauge cluster, and they ran it all the way through 96. And I love this gauge cluster the best. I just think it's fabulous. Some people like the C5s more. I like them both. They look a little bit different. The C5 is a little bit softer to look at. But I like the orange glow to this. It just looks good with the black in here. And I like the gauges that are on display in analog, and all the gauges you can get through digital as well. So when I race, I usually leave it on oil temperature here, and I kind of go back and forth, but I always know where my coolant temps are on the gauge, okay? That's pretty simple. That's always right here, your coolant temps. But just the same, I think it's always important to look at your oil temps, because your oil temps are really going to tell you what's going on with your engine. If you're being too hard on it, you're going to see oil temps pushing 300 degrees. That's really high. At that point, you want to slow it down. Okay, now you're probably wondering, why do I have an A-pillar pod mount here? Well, for two reasons. See that flashing light right there? That's my RPM gauge. And you're probably wondering, why do I have two RPM gauges here? Well, the main reason is that's a shift light, and I have it pre-programmed to 6,000 RPMs. Why do I do that? Well, I don't want to over rev the engine. So somebody did that to this car, who shall remain nameless. When you over rev your engine, you really can do damage. And this car doesn't have the super light valve lifters that Dave's has, so it doesn't really make sense to rev it above 6,500. And he basically told me, however you rev this, like if you don't over rev the engine and you keep it around 6,000, it's gonna last a lot longer if you don't over rev it. So I keep it to 6,000, maybe a little bit above, but usually I'm just below 6,000 RPMs. And that's by design, to ensure that the engine lives a long time, because you don't want to have to build these very often. All right, now to answer your question, why do I have these autometer gauges here? Well, actually, pro comp. So this one right here is an additional oil pressure gauge. Why is that so important? Well, if you don't have oil pressure, you need to shut your engine off, because if you have a failing oil pump and your rotating assembly's moving and you have fuel, you have spark, you're literally having parts moving around that aren't properly lubricated, and that's how you lose an engine for sure. Okay, now I also have a wideband here. Why do I have a wideband when I don't have a supercharger? That's probably really rare. The main reason why I do that, every now and then, it really came down to one situation where we weren't sure if the oil pressure gauge was working properly. So Dave said, hey, I have an A-pillar pod mount I could put on, but it only mounts two. And I said, well, throw in a wideband. And the idea is, if you suspect your tuning's weird and you don't have HP tuners plugged in, because I don't know, you're racing or driving around, you can look at that gauge, and the gauge will give you some idea in terms of how the tuning is. Now, idling, it's not going to tell you much, but when you get on the gas, it will tell you a lot. Okay? All right, so that's pretty much most of the interior. And I just want people to see what this looks like from the driver's position. This is really what it looks like. And it looks fabulous when you're in this thing. I can't even tell you. I've been in some really exotic, expensive sports cars, including Ferraris. And there's a lot of similarities there. One of the things that's an adjustment if you've never driven a Corvette is judging the distance of where the hood is from here. Because when you're here, it looks like things are 3 feet away, but in reality, it's much closer. So I always tell people, add 3 feet to the hood if you ever drive a Corvette, or if this is the first time you've driven a Corvette. Otherwise, you're gonna frustrate yourself and hit things, when you're parking. Okay, I want to go in the back now, and I want to show you some of the things I've done back here. Okay, one thing I haven't showed you thus far is there's actually two switches for the rear hatch. Now, there's kind of a low-key button here. If you pop this open, you see that? You hit that button, that'll release the rear hatch, okay? Now, it's funny because on a C5, that opens your fuel door. And there's also a switch right here inside the driver's door. So what you do is flip that switch, and it opens right up instantly. So I want to show you this because it is a glass hatch. It opens all the way up. Now the C5s are a little bit different in that they have metal attached to them, and the whole piece just kind of comes up. It's probably a better design. It looks like it is a better design, but this has actually worked really well. The weather stripping on here is very good quality. All of this is like close to 30 years old, and I put silicone grease on it every now and then, but it's pretty much held up, and I'm very happy about that. It doesn't leak anywhere. Now, what you're looking at is the crossbar. Now I want to show you some of the things I have on here, some of the mods that have really helped increase with the structural rigidity, although this helps a little bit. This is mostly just for the 5-point harnesses. Now, as you can see, I actually have two different harnesses on here. I have a harness there that Dave put on that's obviously really high quality here. Low key, you see how that's drilled into it? And over there, it's strapped. Well, I did the one that was strapped, okay? I did that many years ago, and I actually had that on the driver's side. But once we got pretty serious with the car, he moved it over to the passenger side and he put the impact belts on, which are really important because I don't really have anyone riding with me, like if I'm on a road course. And I shouldn't say never. Sometimes I'll have an instructor with me or a friend. But in reality, I'm the only one in the car when I'm racing. Okay, so how does this work? This thing just bolts right in here using the B-pillar here mount of the seat belt, and that was a design by a man named Dave Cooper, who used to have this company called RD Racing. It was primarily an internet company. I believe he was from Oklahoma, although I could be wrong. He might be from Missouri. I know they're nowhere near each other, but I'm just trying to remember. It was a long time ago. Now, he's an older guy. He's since retired and closed up shop. But this guy had some really, really nice modifications that you can do to improve the chassis. So let's go back under the hood and I want to show you that. And of course, one thing I should show you, see these little things on the corner? This is where you can put the roof in. And I don't want to really go over that at the moment because I'm going to talk to you in the future about how to improve the structural rigidity of this car so you can enjoy it with the roof out of it and not have it shaking and flexing. But that's going to be a whole entire video itself because there's a lot to that, all right? Okay, so the first Dave Cooper mod I ever put on this car is something called the Camber brace. Now, I quickly realized one night when I was driving my 96 Corvette, it must have been about a month or two after I bought it, and I remember it was a Saturday night, and I remember driving it around with the roof off, all excited because I'd never had a convertible before. And it feels like a convertible when you remove the roof. It really does. You just feel the wind on you. It's an amazing feeling. But I noticed I stopped at a Burger King. I'll never forget this. And when I came through the drive-thru and I went back out on the El Camino and I'm heading back home, I'm like, something doesn't feel right, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Well, I had done some research, and when I started reading about removing the roof, there were a lot of articles about the structural rigidity of the car, of the C4s, and how they're challenged that way, that the roof provides about 40% of the structure of the car. Maybe not that much. Maybe it's like 30 or 35%. But either way, you remove that much structure, and it's noticeable, especially because they're stiff. I mean, even with the FE2 suspension, the mono leaf spring provides a lot of stiffness and rigidity. So when the springs are stiff like that and you don't have that roof in it, it kind of has this kind of shaking that goes on. And I'll talk more about that later in future videos, but I do want to show you some of the mods that I did to help prevent a lot of that, help mitigate it. Okay, down in here, we're looking down, you're going to see a bar here. Now I'm going to put my finger on that bar, okay? Now that bar runs all the way over to the other side. Okay, why does one have that bar on there? Because that bar essentially boxes in the front end. And when you box in that front end, it really, really helps with the anterior structure of the car. So you feel stiff in the steering wheel. You don't feel the steering wheel shaking at all. And it is really nice. Now, my mechanic doesn't really like the camber brace. He says it's kind of an ugly bar. Dave says that. And whatever, it works. It really works. And it was... it's not super hard to install, but it does take time. Now, I didn't put it in. My mechanic did. You can see the shims right here for the alignments. Now, the one knock on the bar, and this is why Dave hates this bar, is that anytime you want to align this thing, see the bolt there? If you want to get a shim inside of it, you have to remove the bar. So that's an additional labor cost. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever want to buy one of those. It's called a camber brace because it holds your camber in place in the front. If you ever want to buy one of those and you're going to put it on, just keep in mind, every time you bring it in to get it aligned, they're going to have to remove the bar to get that bolt out, okay? So I like it. It really makes a difference in the handling. And that's one of the few little things I have that Dave doesn't have on his car that I think makes it a little bit better on mine. Okay, at the front here is this vortex ram air. I showed you a little bit of this earlier, but I want to give you a closer look of it. It's really a nice ram air here because all the air comes in low from that radiator shroud here, and everything's sealed up here. And I'm going to try to get underneath the front of it to show you some of the stuff there, but it's very low to the ground, and I really should have it on a lift to show you all that stuff. And maybe I'll be able to do that one day if it's ever at Dave's shop and I have time to actually do this. So the other thing too, you'll notice the air intake here, it doesn't have the curving coupler on it. And I know why they have those curves on it. It's a more reliable thing that doesn't require maintenance. You notice I always have tape and things like that on it, because these things, they slip out. The ones that are completely round and smooth and flat. Okay, checking out the back end of the car here. That's the AccuSump right there. It's mounted in back of the car. But before I get into that, for those of you that own C4s, you're going to notice that my spare tire is missing. And the reason why is you save about 50 pounds between the tire and the mounting hardware, and I just think it looks a lot better. And then you're able to get the AccuSump in the back here. And this is really good because there's not really a lot of room up front. With C5s, they fit much better up front, but C4s are narrower, a little bit shorter, so they don't have as much room for things like this up front. This is the Moroso AccuSump. And as you can see, if you take a close look, right there, that actually has the amount of oil pressure that's in it, and I can see it's at 40 PSI. And there's a line, a stainless steel line that goes from there to the engine. And anytime you go into a turn and oil sloshes and there's the sensor senses that there's not enough oil pressure, then this accumulator here, this AccuSump, which carries like a couple quarts of oil in it itself, maybe 3 quarts of oil, and it will make up for the loss of oil pressure in the engine. And that's really crucial when you're running race tires, because without it, you run into problems with oiling and you could lose your bearings. If you lose your bearings, you'll lose an engine basically. You have to remove it and get the rods resized. It's big money. So that's why you want to do that correctly. Okay, in the back here also you can see is the sway bar. Now this is not a Z51 sway bar. This is actually an aftermarket sway bar from Vette Brakes. It was important because after a while the car was starting to push, meaning understeer versus oversteer, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We also have the Vette Brake tow rods here. They're actually tucked in right here. They're the black ones that are just above the half shafts there. Those are really good at keeping your camber when you're going into corners, which is really essential for getting traction exiting turns. You can see them down here as well, right above the exhaust there. They're black. It's hard for me to reach because I literally don't have a lift. I'm like trying to crawl under the car. And of course there's the Borle exhaust right here. These guys really do the trick. Sounds awesome. And it's not too loud, you know, which is good because when you have an engine that's aggressive, it's going to be super loud. So when you have an AccuSump, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with it. So in addition to protecting your engine in corners, it also allows you to pre-oil the engine. And what that basically means is I have a switch down here that you can see. So what you do is you turn the ignition on, you get all your gauges working, and then you go down to this little switch here, and this will activate the AccuSump as soon as I flip the switch. Now, I'm going to put the camera on the oil pressure gauge, and I want you to look at that. So as you can see, the oil gauge is building oil pressure. Engine is not on. Now I start it, and the beautiful thing was I was able to create 30 pounds of oil pressure in the engine before I even start it. And that's a real advantage, and a lot of engine wear does come from that, from starting your engine cold, or even if it's not cold, but not having that instant oil pressure. Okay, going back and forth here between the GoPro and my iPhone. One of the reasons is the GoPro 10, it shuts itself off when it gets too hot. And where I'm at in Tracy right now, it is really hot right now. Northern California has been just under a heat spell. Seems like forever now. Okay, let's go underneath the car and see if I can show you some of this stuff. Okay, so looking underneath here, see the wheels? That's in case I get too low and something's gonna hit. Those rollers will lift it over it. And they're actually welded right to my X-frame that's underneath. Now the X-frame is one of the things that Dave Cooper made that really strengthens the structural rigidity of the car. So just think of it as like an X, right? And it crisscrosses each direction. Now triangular support is always better, is always much better support than, sorry about that laying on my back here. Triangular support is always much stronger than just straight lines. So those of you that know geometry and engineering really well will understand that. So if you're ever not sure, you've never noticed it before, go drive like on any bridge, especially if you drive on like that Bay Bridge, if you're in the Bay Area, or the San Mateo Bridge, you'll see a lot of triangular support, right? Everything goes in an X triangulated pattern. And that's what an X-frame basically is. If you look at my finger here, so the X, I can't make an X while holding the camera, but you get the idea, right? Imagine an X. You get one side, like the left. I'm just making so much sense right now, huh? Okay, hopefully you can see this pretty well. This is basically where the underside of the car is. You see the AccuSump again, and if you look forward of the exhaust, hopefully this shows up in the video, you can see the X-frame. And like I said, I'm going to do a future video on structural rigidity on C4s, and I'll explain a lot more of this in depth. And what I'm going to do is try to get the car in the air so it's easier to see, because this thing's really low to the ground, and I'm not the smallest guy in the world. I'm over around 200 pounds. The thing I want to talk to you about is the brakes. So just as a warning here, I'm going to get a closer look here. And I know these wheels kind of obstruct some of the brakes, but I'm going to tell you this. You don't need crazy modification of your brakes. Look, you get these power slot rotors. You can get the ones that have some dimples in them if you want. It doesn't really matter. You just want the ones that are cryogenically frozen. Now, the idea is you don't want them to crack. So good quality rotors on a C4 and a C5 like this. I'm trying to remember who makes this. It might be Centrex or StopTech or one of those companies. I'll try to find out and write it in the comments section. Right here is the caliper, and it's the factory caliper, and you're probably noticing it's only a 2-piston. Take it from me, you don't need more than a 2-piston caliper. The real thing that makes this car stop is not only the quality of the rotor, and it's a good quality steel rotor, it's also the friction material. So we use something called, and this is a piece of proprietary information that Dave would want to kill me for talk about it anyway. So it's called performance friction. That is the type of pads you want to use on this. Now they have different levels of performance friction. Performance friction pads. The O1 compound is the kind that stops really violently. That's what these do. Now, I don't recommend these if you're just going to do street driving, because they're very noisy. They squeak loudly. I don't care, because I know that's friction at work. But a lot of people, they don't like to hear that stuff when they drive. And the other thing is, it will turn your rotors black. Excuse me, it'll turn your wheels black. I mean, if you go race, after about 2 or 3 laps, you come back in the pits, your wheels are going to be covered with brake dust. So if you don't want brake dust, you don't want the noise, you can get the performance friction pads that are one step below the 01 compound. I don't know what the name of it is, but the 01 compound is the one you want. 01 compound is the one you want if you want to stop violently. And that is the best friction material for your C4, without a doubt, okay? That was proprietary information I just shared. I want to show you some of the things that's really nice about Corvettes. See this right here? So what that basically does is that vents a lot of the heat from under the hood. And how does it do that? Well, all the heat that's coming from the engine will go right through this little piece right here and out that door and ventilate a lot of the heat. Now, is it as complex as what you see nowadays with cars? No, not at all. But it was ahead of its time because cars in this time period really didn't have this stuff. By contrast, you know, this is the thing you're going to find out. C5s, they're just so much better with the design and up. Look at that. Look at all the air that gets through there, right? That vents the all the heat that comes from under the hood. And the other thing that's neat about the C5s, look at this. This cools your brakes. This was designed so all the air comes in here and it cools your brakes. That's really neat. So C4s didn't actually have that, but that is a really neat feature. I wanted to show you that. All right, this car is absolutely insane. Every time I start it up, I'm just amazed. Taking it out for a test drive for you now. I don't really do very much driving in this on the street because it's a race car, it's loud, all the above. But I want to give you some idea what it's like on the street. I mean, it drives well on the street. It's definitely streetable, but with the 800-pound spring in the front and the 475-pound spring in the back, it's not the smoothest ride. But good Lord, is it fun. You know, and it's every bit as responsive on the street as you would expect it to be on the as it is on the track, I should say. And the torque is just crazy. I mean, like, you barely touch the throttle, and this thing just absolutely will light the tires up. Even the race tires. You don't have any temperature in these tires. Oh my God. Still warming up the engine a little bit, but we'll get on it in a second here. Want to get out of the residential neighborhood. This is where I need to be extra careful. Always want to be aware of police being around. Okay, I don't see anybody. Good as time than any. Oh my God. That is really something. That is way too much for the street, to be sure. Yeah, it just, somebody asked me the other day about the miles per gallon. We don't have that rating on this car. We have miles per gallon. And it will give you 20 miles per gallon. Hell, it'll probably give you 200 miles per gallon. Wow. It is really something. Like I said, this is just too much fun. You know, the handling's just pretty stunning. I mean, you just rip around corners. Like it's nothing. Got a wild cam in it. It's actually pretty smooth driving at slow speeds. I mean, it's a little twitchy in the lower RPMs, I'm not gonna lie, but it's still drivable. Like if you wanted to daily drive this, if you could, in another state, of course, you could do it. It wouldn't be the best daily driver. I'm not saying it is, but it's definitely can be done. It's as fun on the street as it is the track. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a lot more fun at the track than it is on the street, but it's still fun on the street. Make no mistake about it. Okay, we'll get on a little bit. And as you can see, you catch up very quickly to what's in front of you. It's insane. That was a review of my 96 Corvette. If you enjoyed it, please smash the like button and subscribe. I love being in the algorithm because I get my content out to more and more people. All right, take care, everyone. Peace out.